Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, can you believe it? This is Christmas Eve, and so I'm going to go ahead and dispense with the traditional monologue just to talk about how fortunate we are as a nation and as a people, irrespective of the fact that we've gone through a very turgid year, a very turbulent year, in which the fissures of division and divisiveness have become a hallmark and a staple of our current state of polity and our current system of polity. But despite all of this, there is a great plethora of reasons why we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, are doing well and should be viewing things in a very positive light. And where this comes really into the forefront is with respect to the fact that we are still a free nation. Sure, we are still facing a great many problems, and these are problems that are not necessarily going to be easily overcome, but if there is any people on the face of the planet who can do well with this, and who can overcome the great hurdles, obstacles, and adversities that have been placed in our path, it is none other than we the people of these United States of America. And that goes to the great revolutionary spirit that makes up who we are. A great spirit that literally binds us together and brings us closer. And I think that part of the problem that we face right now is that we have basically gone forth and done a misnomer with what our nation is and what our nation stands for and represents. You see, we've heard the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media refer to this notion of nationalism over and over again. And that is something that has to do with this whole ridiculous notion of the alleged alt-right or alternative right that is actually a bit of a misnomer in and of itself, in so much as the alleged alt-right, or the so-called alt-right, or alt-Reich, as we call it here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, is based off of a tribalist view. You see, the thing that the United States is well known for, and the thing that has been with us since the inception of our nation some 235 plus years ago, is the fact that we are actually a constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic. That is unique. That is something that no other nation on earth could claim to have in as open and honest and continuous fashion as we have in the United States of America. It's a unique aspect to us, and it goes directly to the heart of the matter of who we are. And therefore, to really understand why I say this is so important, and to understand why my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, and I have oft times referenced this on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, it's important to look at a bit of our history. Now, I know that we've done that on so many of our episodes, and it's because history is perhaps the greatest teacher that is available to we the people. It is something that allows us to hold a mirror up to ourselves to gain a fuller and better understanding of who we are. And the history of the United States, particularly with this holiday, is something that I believe that the revisionist historians that infest our ivory towers of academia from coast to coast and border to border have done their utmost to hide. to snuff out, to basically have us believe as though it is not a good thing, not something that we should pay attention to, not something that goes to the heart of who we are. But the truth of the matter is, it does go to the heart of who we are. The truth of the matter is that the Christmas spirit is an indelible part and characteristic of the American people. It goes all the way back to the foundation of this country. And during that long, drawn-out, bloody, bitter affair known as the American War of Independence, we came so close to being vanquished by the greatest, most powerful, and organized military force known to man at the time, that of the Empire of Great Britain. Many thought it was foolhardy of our founding fathers to think that we could even attempt to stand up to the martial might of Great Britain. But they understood that there was an intrinsic nature about what it was that we were fighting for, and what it was that defines us both as a nation and as a people, that would overcome the hurdles, obstacles, and adversities that were placed in their path. And the resolve that they had, particularly with respect to their sacred honor, just shows us all that we need to be inspired to ensure that this nation is restored back onto the path to prosperity. Recall that Patrick Henry gave that famous speech in which he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And what that spoke to was directly to this notion of sacred honor. This idea that there was something greater than just the status quo that existed in the world at the time. And it's something that we have oft times addressed here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, so much as we say that the whole of the United States is greater than the sum of its parts. It ties directly into those undeniable natural law tenets that form the cornerstone of our Constitution, which, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, or the Supremacy Clause, is the supreme law of the land, and thereby also is the cornerstone of our constitutionally endowed republic. You see, when we say that the dark and twisted game of semantics has been used by the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media to bamboozle the American people, it goes back to the Civil War even, when there was this great proclamation by so many of the politicians on either side of that divisive conflict that said we were a democracy. That misnomer is something that was used over and over and over again, to the point of where it is almost synonymous with how we like to think of ourselves and how our popular culture perceives us. But again, when we stop and think about it and examine it in a truly objective fashion, we come to the immediate realization that no, the United States of America is not a democracy, because a democracy is quintessentially mob rule. And you see, our founding fathers understood that in such mob rule scenarios, we would end up with a tyranny of the majority. You see, the sacred rights of the individual is the foundational basis of the United States. It's deeply rooted in the notion that the natural law, which is a type of philosophy that basically states that it is a code of conduct that can be universally understood as it is inscribed upon the hearts of all mankind, and that it can be universally understood by the application of simple logic and reason. That tells us that the rights of the individual is what gives the United States its strength. So think of it a bit as a fabric. I know we've heard the term societal fabric before, but what is it that makes a quilt or a patchwork of a cloth or shirt or anything strong? It's the individual fibers. That's what gives its rigidity. That's what gives it its shape and form. That is why our founding fathers, in their sagacity and near infinite wisdom and foresight, inherently understood that the rights of the individual is what drives the nation. And it's not just the nation that it drives. It drives our system of polity. It pushes us to the forefront and encourages us to act in ways that would be even greater and more beneficial for the nation at large. And again, that ties into something that we have mentioned time and time again with respect to Founding Father Samuel Adams, who said that the only way for the United States to flourish as a republic, to live up to the image that the Founding Fathers had conjured up during their struggles for American independence, was for the people to be virtuous. We must all be virtuous, meaning of good moral standing, fiber, and character. And I'm sure that many of you within the ranks of our cherished listening passengers and audience members are puzzled, wondering where it is I'm going with this. Well, let me try and tie this into the Christmas message. We all know that in modern society there is this push to have the war on religious expression, the war on our time-honored values, institutions, and traditions. We've seen that all throughout the disastrous 2 terms of this Barack Hussein Obama regime. But there is a cultural reason beyond just the usual religious fervor, which is important, because recall, Sam Adams was right when he said that we must be a virtuous republic, and part of that is having a moral standard, having a set of social mores of right and wrong, good and evil, what is socially acceptable and not. But on the battlefield of that long, drawn-out, and bloody affair known as the American War of Independence, as I said, we came close to teetering on the edge of death and destruction and complete loss of our cause. And that cause was of liberty, of independence, of this idea of protecting the fundamental and inalienable rights of the sovereign individual, which were endowed to them by their Creator, who happens to be none other than the God of nature himself. That is the intrinsic part of what makes us a strong and robust and vibrant and free nation. But on the battlefield, after the opening salvos occurred in Lexington and Concord in the latter part of 1775, after the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, the combined might and force of the greatest, most well-organized military force known to man was handing defeat after successive defeat to the Continental forces, threatening to vanquish the entire cause of liberty once and for all. The British saw this as the perfect opportunity to teach those upstart colonials in their mind a lesson. A lesson in which they would humble us and they would force us to come to them on bended knee and beg for forgiveness. What was it about the British that made them stand in such vitriol, or with such vitriol, against the Continental forces? Well, it was that they viewed the colonials as being disrespectful, and they did have this deep-seated animosity towards them. You have to recall that most of the early colonies in the United States were founded by people that were fleeing the sorts of persecution that had become the norm in the religious wars that had erupted during the era immediately following the Protestant Reformation. And so There was already this kind of looking down the nose at them, that these people were fanatics who had gone to the New World. And then after the British had been involved in the 7 Years' War, which was a long, drawn-out conflict on its own against the monarchical forces of Britain and France, there was this idea of, hey, the colonists had the French and Indian War, which was a theater of the 7 Years' War, and we had to expend great amounts of capital to defend them, and by this notion of virtual representation, the colonists were able to receive all of the benefits of our protection, and yet they are not paying for it. We bankrolled everything, and we are approaching the precipice of basically losing everything on bankruptcy. And of course, the British approach to bankruptcy was to have debtor's prison, to basically eke out whatever last cent that they could get out of them through these efforts. And that in and of itself was something that would differentiate and distinguish the United States as our laws would develop and emerge as a separate and independent entity. But that was at a different time. They were still looking at us as second-class citizens. The British believed in the use of strong-arm centralization. This was something that went back to their medieval times. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, Malus Scotorum. Part of that was bringing in the kingdoms of Wales and Scotland under the English umbrella, English dominance. We still see the strains and fibers of the divisiveness and the animosity that arose out of that hundreds of years later. That was all part of what we saw when Scotland was trying to break away completely. And then Brexit, there were strains of it there too. This idea of central authority. Now, unlike the French, the British had developed a truly revolutionary approach to monarchy. They were a constitutional, and are a constitutional monarchy. It was started, as I've mentioned on so many previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, on that muddy field in Runnymede in the summer of 1215, when John I was forced to sign the Great Charter, or Magna Carta, that kept mentioning the supreme law of the land. Well, it didn't mention supreme law of the land, but it mentioned the law of the land. This idea that this divine right of kings, where kings were explicitly anointed by God omnipotent to lord their power over everyone, hence the whole liege lord thing of the feudalist system. No, they didn't believe that. And gradually over time, in incremental fashion, the natural law, which is the ultimate truth, managed to keep bubbling up to the surface to where it was taking a more prominent position within society. And it just goes to show that in it all, throughout it all, we are so fortunate and so capable of seeing where we can go from here and what it is that we can accomplish from here, because it goes all the way back to 1215 and comes to its logical and inexorable conclusion with what our founding fathers had developed with the Constitutional Convention. You see, when they drafted and ratified the Constitution, that was the logical next step. The next step for understanding that the natural law tenets work best when the rights of the people are fully understood and are fully recognized and protected by government. And you see, the Constitution is this great social contract or compact. In fact, the greatest ever devised by the hands of men, yet divinely inspired by providence above. And so it ties back into the spirit of what they were fighting for. As they were experiencing defeat after defeat, George Washington had to have felt the pressures that were building on him, because there were those within the ranks of the Continental Authority and Continental Congress that didn't think he was qualified for the position, didn't think that he was going to be able to secure victory for them. No, they felt as though he had basically led the entire impetus of the struggle astray. Philadelphia was falling, New York was falling, New Jersey was already in the hands of the British, and it seemed as though inevitable defeat was just around the corner, and that there was no way for the colonists to basically state their claim and to win this ultimate cause, this just cause, this cause that produced the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events. But he didn't give up faith. You see, Washington had a strong sense of faith. Washington was driven. He understood that the inherent nature of the cause was one that was meant for the ages. And one of the things that my first officer, Jeremy Graventon, and I have oft-times referenced on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, is that the cause of liberty and this notion of the fundamental and inalienable rights and the natural law tenets being timeless is found within the language to the preamble to the Constitution. The preamble serves the purpose of giving us an outline stating why the Founding Fathers felt it was necessary to come together to frame that magnificent document. We the people, in order to create a more perfect union, to promote the domestic tranquility, and to basically advance the blessings of liberty for our posterity, comes into mind here. Posterity, that means for generations to come. For the up-and-coming generations, for those generations which have yet to be born. This is why we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, are called upon to provide proactive maintenance and defense to our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. And so, on Christmas Day, 1776, George Washington was looking at an unraveling situation before him. He was looking at the cause teetering on the brink of oblivion, teetering on becoming but a tragic footnote of history. But he didn't give up faith. Because again, that spirit that we see in our foundational documents and their sacred honor, this is what was driving our founding fathers. It is what motivated them to keep going despite the adversities they faced, despite the overwhelming obstacles, hurdles, and adversities that stood in their path. Because they realized that what they were fighting for was something that was far greater than themselves. It was something that was far greater than their own quest for greatness. You see, they didn't frame it that way. The greatness rested with the people. The greatness rested with the natural law tenets that drove and spearheaded this entire movement. That is what mattered. That is what allowed them to strive for greater success, to champion the visions that became the cornerstone and the staples of the most open, honest, free, and secure government and nation that this world has ever seen. And when we stop and think about that, that's not some small thing. That's not some light accomplishment. That is an amazing attribute of who we are as a nation and as a people. And one of the things that Washington fully realized during that struggle was that building new types of information and intelligence, particularly with respect to the Continental Army, would allow them to outmaneuver and to vanquish the most well-organized, the most well-funded, the most powerful military force known to man at that time, that being the military might of Great Britain. And so he had built a spy network, the Culpeper spy network, that managed to get intelligence to him that there were German mercenaries, Hessian mercenaries, that were camped and stationed in the town of Trenton, New Jersey. Now, this was the perfect opportunity for Washington to score a psychological victory. A victory which would show and demonstrate not only to his men within the rank and file of the Continental Army, but also the members of the Continental Congress, that the cause for liberty was not dead, that the cause for liberty was worth fighting for, despite these hurdles, despite these obstacles, despite these adversities. The strength of character of the natural law tenets that would become the cradle of our very society, of our very government, could and would ultimately prevail. So, he did something that was unprecedented in 18th century warfare. It was a very cold winter. Most military forces, particularly of the European model, would set camp for the winter and not engage. In fact, Washington himself did this many times. We have indelible images like that of Valley Forge and the suffering that occurred there. And then at his other camp in Morristown, New Jersey, where there was real privation, where there was real suffering, where there was real starvation. But in 1776, on Christmas Eve, he had received the information about the Hessian camp in Trenton, New Jersey. Now, this was after we had suffered a slew of defeats. This was after the entire weight of the British forces were brought to bear upon us. And France had not entered the fray yet, and so we were standing literally alone, fighting for an ideal on faith. Because there was certainly no guarantee at the time that we would succeed. There was no guarantee at the time that the cause of liberty would come to fruition and that these United States of America would become a nation. The most free nation the world had ever seen. None of those guarantees existed at the time. They were doing it on faith. And the amount of faith that our founding fathers had, and that the generations that fought to secure the blessings of liberty and to promote those blessings for their posterity, is incredible. They went against all of the hardship. They went with lack of training, and they conjured up the ability to train on their own at later points under von Steuben, and they would eventually overcome the greatest military force known to man. But at that time, none of that was certain. And so Washington needed to have a victory. Needed to have a victory that would send this resonating and resounding message to Congress, to the American people, to his own men, and to his fellow officers in the Continental Army, that they could achieve this victory. Now, we've all seen that iconic painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, the ice-choked river. You know, when I was in school, they didn't teach that very well either. They didn't talk about the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey. They didn't talk about the great weight of what was in the balance there. They taught a sort of quasi gung-ho history, because the type of revisionist history that we see today, that is nothing short of cultural Marxism, had not come into the forefront 20 some odd years ago yet, in private schools at least. And so they taught that all of the founding fathers just came together and said, yeah, we're going to do this, and it was like that. Easy come, easy pickings. Just, it was preordained and destined to occur. But that was certainly not the way they saw it. That was not the way they felt about it as they were living through it in those trying times. And therefore, they had to have meaningful victories. They had to have something concrete that they could latch onto. So the whole purpose of crossing that ice-choked Delaware, which was displayed in that romantic and dramatic painting, was to get into New Jersey, to get to where they could do a surprise attack on the Hessian mercenaries. Now, the Hessians were brutal people. They were very professional soldiers that fought for money. That's what they did. And they, of course, looked contemptuously upon the Continental forces. They saw them as these ragamuffins that were upstarts that really shouldn't have had a say and shouldn't even be going forth and attempting to question the might of this great and ancient monarchical system. And so, even though they had found the plans of the attack, they ignored them. They ignored them. In their hubris and arrogance and their vainglorious pride, they thought that these upstart colonists could not achieve, could not defeat them. And so they had no idea that Washington had pulled off a spectacular feat in military engineering and ingenuity in getting across in those inclement conditions. In a time when, as I mentioned earlier, armies usually just camped out for the winter and would not engage, Washington was ready to strike first blood. Washington was ready to take the fight to these enemies that would dare stand against the sacred honor of what would become the United States of America. And so they crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day. And on the next morning, they attacked, overwhelmed, and routed the Hessians. It was a spectacular victory. The Hessians weren't even really guarding their camp. They had two guards out there, and I think they were drunk because they were enjoying the Christmas holiday. And so we see that in that battle, and the willingness to strive for the greatness that would become the United States of America in a time when most thought we wouldn't engage in that, or that we shouldn't. The very future of our nation was secured. The blessings of liberty were secured on that day. And that is the significant reason as to why we consider Christmas a federal holiday. It is to celebrate the birth of freedom, the fight for liberty that occurred, and the fact that we were able to overcome the hurdles, obstacles, and adversities that were before us. Now, just because we achieved that victory did not mean that the fight ended there. No, the war for American independence lasted from 1775, with those opening salvos at Lexington and Concord, until 1781. That was a very long, bitter, bloody, drawn-out affair. But it spoke to what the ingenuity of freedom, and what the natural law tenets can literally and actually achieve. It spoke to how we as a nation and as a people could stand for something that is so magnificent. And of course, I'm speaking of those cherished and sacred liberties and freedoms that we exercise and enjoy today. But unfortunately, because we have those nefarious forces that have infiltrated our institutions of education and have infiltrated our information media sources and outlets, this story has been all but lost. Now, sure, there are some wonderful examples of this coming up again in popular culture. For instance, AMC has the series Washington Spies. It's fairly historically accurate. Yes, they have elements of soap opera in it. But it does go to the heart of what it was that they were fighting for, what it was that they were achieving, and just how close we came to losing it all on a multitude of separate occasions. And again, to realize that they did this fight, that they kept striving for this, that they kept pushing for this on faith alone, because they were in uncharted waters. This had never been attempted before, at least to such an extent as it was in our cause of liberty and independence. So they had no idea whether it would succeed. They had faith, though. They thanked their creator, the God of nature, at every opportunity that they managed to secure victories against all the odds. And they continued to move day by day, moment by moment, striving to achieve the victory. Now, mistakes were made, and lessons were learned along the way, and many of those lessons were hard-learned lessons. But by learning the lessons and by refusing to deviate from that all-encompassing aspect that is the whole impetus of who we are as a nation and as a people, what would become the defining features of what would be the United States, we created something that is amazing. And to think that it was based on faith makes me really sit back in awe. I am completely inspired by what that generation was able to achieve. Flawed men, yes, but brilliant. They were brilliant, and they were willing to admit that they were flawed. Now, juxtapose that to the way that politicians on either side of the political aisle today act. You see that there is a vainglorious attempt to snuff out an approach to faith, a belief in something greater. We see that there are these incessant and tiresome efforts to eradicate any type of faith, whether it be nativity scenes, whether it be prayer in school, whether it be crosses on government cemeteries, or displaying certain historical flags. The twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism stand in stark opposition to that foundational spirit and to the faith that drove our founding fathers to create this nation, to stand up against those staggering, shocking odds, and to risk everything. Their lives, their health, their safety, their personal fortunes. But you know what mattered most to them? Above all else, it was sacred honor. Stop and think about just how incredible that is. Sacred honor, sacred honor. Why would they be willing to risk everything for what we would, in this modern era, consider an abstract principle? I'll tell you why. It was because when you have made the epicenter of your entire cause those natural law tenets that are deeply seated and are timeless by their nature, immutable, you realize that it's your honor that will outlive you. It is your honor and the way that you acknowledge the rights of your fellow popular sovereign individuals that allows the nation to be free and to promote those freedoms for all of posterity. That's an amazing aspect, and it is a central aspect of who we are as a nation and as a people. And again, it is something that is time-honored, so valuable, something that we simply cannot ignore. But those nefarious forces that are seeking to rewrite our history and are seeking to snuff out our entire character as a nation and a people don't care about that. They are working towards annihilating that because they think they know better. And it's like the great philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, that French philosopher, who admired America during her halcyon days, said of the soft despotism of socialism. He said essentially that it was nothing short of a new age type of feudalism because they wished and sought to micromanage the facets of our daily lives. From cradle until grave, that was the sort of system that our founding fathers had fought against. This sort of hybrid system of mercantilism and feudalism. Mercantilism being that there is a finite set of goods that should be controlled by a certain portion of the population, and it should all be done for the government. Mercantilism is, in a short form, a type of socialism. And it's interesting to note that the early colonists tried a socialist system of group ownership, collectivist type of ownership. And it damn near destroyed them. Damn near wiped them out. It damn near made the entire experiment fail before it even got off the ground. And so again, those are some of the hard-fought, hard-learned lessons that help define us, that help spearhead just who we are as a nation and as a people. And again, it is not something that can be ignored. Because when we do ignore it, we do so at our great peril. We do so in a way that makes us ignorant. Ignorant meaning we just don't know better. But we should. We should because our history is there. The primary documents and sources are there. The fact that our Constitution has been the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events is an undeniable fact. And it is an amazing fact. It is a fact that speaks directly to what our founding fathers, in their sagacity and near infinite wisdom and foresight, innately and inherently understood. That these things for which we fight and that we strive are greater than we are. That the whole of this nation is greater than the sum of its parts. And that is seen in the beautiful and, dare I say, poetic language that is contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. And it speaks directly to the values that we have and how we can continue to strive for these better angels of our nature, despite all of our differences, despite all of these political attacks that have been promoting penultimate concerns. Again, the whole reason why we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, say that we must foster and promote this fluent and working knowledge and understanding of not only our shared Constitution, but also our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights is because it goes directly back to this foundational spirit. It goes back to the very notions of what has defined us as a nation and as a people. Because without that moral compass, without being the virtuous republic that Sam Adams said we had to be, in order to literally keep this nation in the forefront of doing well and of being that type of system that was great and free, we have to understand these things. We must promote a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of it. Otherwise, we lose everything. And yes, while we look at the current atmosphere and the current state of political affairs in this country, it is very easy to sit there and think that perhaps we could lose it all again. Perhaps we are on the precipice of another staggering defeat. But we have to have the same type of faith that George Washington had when he led his men across the ice-choked Delaware River to launch his surprise attack on the holiday that is Christmas, to secure the fight for liberty. Because when we embrace that type of faith, when we realize that we are the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty by the very design of this government, going to the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution, that literally serves to remind us of just how much we have accomplished and how much there is, left for us to accomplish. I know it may seem a bit cliched, and that politicians have said this over and over again in election cycle after successive election cycle as they strive for your vote, that America's best days have yet to come. But it's true. It's true because each successive generation works to promote the tenets of liberty, to promote the ability of the people to freely exercise their fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. You see, we're not just supposed to enjoy exercising our rights. We're supposed to go out and make it even easier for the up-and-coming generations, and indeed those generations which have yet to be born, to be able to exercise and enjoy their rights as well. You see, that goes directly to the heart of the matter of what it is that our founding fathers sought to achieve so long ago. And while it is a long time ago, that spirit, by its nature, is timeless. It goes directly to the heart of how this nation can be robust, how this nation may thrive, and how we can be a free people. But we have to understand it. We have to know it. And above all, we have to believe it. We have to have that faith. And that is the reason why we celebrate Christmas. It is to remember that great strain of faith that allowed the upstart colonists to face down the most powerful, well-organized military force known to man, and to come out on top, to literally win. Stop and think about that. Just how fortunate are we? We are exceedingly fortunate. We are the beneficiaries of the greatest birthright of any people on the face of God's green earth. And of course, that of which I speak is none other than the greatest social contract ever devised by the hands of men, yet divinely inspired by providence above. It is our shared United States Constitution that has propelled us to such lofty heights in our relatively brief yet illustrious history. It has guided us for 235 years at least. And God willing, it will guide us another 235 years, because it is immutable, Because it is the codification or the written embodiment of that spirit and drive that pushed us to overcome all those hurdles, obstacles, and adversities that we encountered during our fight for independence, during the strive for liberty, and when we realize that that is what runs in our DNA, when we realize that that is the intrinsic part of our national heritage, character, spirit, but above all, identity, it allows us to stand up to these other attributes that are being pushed forth, either by those disparate and competing factions that are seeking to ultimately, fundamentally, and dare I say irreparably transform these United States of America away from being a constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic to some sort of frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist dystopia or an Orwellian nightmare, don't realize. They want to poo-poo this whole idea that we have a basis in faith, that we have a basis in philosophy, and that those things are far greater than any of the hurdles, obstacles, and adversities that we've faced, and that it will outlast any of these other supposed systems that they have been proposing, because ultimately said systems are not deeply rooted in the natural law tenets as our constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic is. You see, when you start to think of it in that light, and when you start to think of it as your rights, and it as the government belonging to you, the Constitution belonging to you, and that the government is ultimately supposed to serve you, not the other way around, you are then empowered with the ability to say enough is enough, and no, you cannot do this to my country. And because I want things to be better for my posterity, we strive to improve the condition of all Americans. You see, that's why we say it's so important to realize that there is this overarching greater good that exists within the United States. That's why it is so important for us to fully utilize and realize that the government, when it acts in this rogue, tyrannical, and ultimately illegitimate fashion, is insulting us and is threatening the posterity of this nation, that we can come together, standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity and unity, and rejecting these nefarious forces, and rejecting these attempts to drastically, fundamentally, and irreparably redefine us. You see, we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, wield a much greater amount of power than we realize. We have been led astray by these nefarious forces that do not want us to realize just how significant the power we possess is. These forces are working to our great detriment. They are working to push us aside and to embrace these villainous approaches to government and to freedom, because they are the enemies of freedom. It's as Ronald Reagan has said, and as we have oft-times reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. He was right when he said that liberty and freedom is always just one generation away from extinction. And what he was speaking to with that was that these forces, these frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists, or the alt-right, or whatever other disparate and competing factions are out there trying to push aside everything that the United States of America stands for, they are relentless. They are meticulous. they will always push to incrementally undermine these United States of America, to try and redefine us in the image of socialism. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. It cannot work, because it goes against the strain and fiber of all that we hold near and dear. And therefore, we cannot, we must not, we shall not back down from this. We are going to overcome all of these hurdles, obstacles, and adversities, as we must. Because there's no choice. We have no other choice. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for a round of eggnog for you folks, as always. Thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. We hope to see you again next time. Have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.